Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and today we get to talk about world federalism and world government. And I have two friends with me who know a thing or two about the subject. And I have to share with you that exactly 72 years ago, I was in high school, and I was on a debate team in which I remember very well the topic of the debate that year was whether or not it was a good idea to have world federalism or world government, as we put it then. And I recall that I was generally much better at giving the arguments in favor of world federalism than against it. But so I think eventually we'll have to consider both points of view now. In Ottawa, I want to introduce Fergus Watt, who runs the World Federalist office in Ottawa and is a renowned activist in world federalism worldwide. He's on various committees. He's chair of this or that, and he goes to the United Nations a lot and is working on some reforms there. So he will be in a great position to tell us more in a second. But let me now introduce John Daniele. Well, he's a cyber expert, a cybersecurity man, but he is also now chairing the Toronto branch of the World Federalists. Both of you say hello. Fergus, hi.
Hello.
And John, hello.
And it's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay. Fergus, launch this thing by telling us a little bit about world federalism. What in the world is it? When did it start? And what should we do about it?
We'll take your questions in that order. World federalism is, in one sense, it's a big framework of ideas for assessing and engaging in international politics, but it's also an NGO, and John and I are both active members of the Canadian section of the World Federalist movement. I'm the company bureaucrat. I run the office in Ottawa as the executive director of the World Federalist Movement Canada, but the World Federalists are organized in some roughly 28 or 30 national and or regional World Federalist organizations around the world. And the international organization has is co-located in New York and near the UN and in The Hague, which is sort of the international legal capital of the United Nations system. And that's in large part because one of our major projects has been being the host agency for the Coalition for the International Criminal Court. And supporting something like a criminal court is an example of the kinds of things that World Federalists would do to build the rule of law. So let's get back to your first question. What is world federalism? If we're familiar in a Canadian context and many other contexts of what federalism is. It's a system of governance where there are layers with jurisdiction shared by some political responsibilities are the responsibility, say, of a national government, and others in a Canadian context, for example, by provinces, or in the US context, states. And so there's layered jurisdiction, usually the rule of law and democratic processes, which would be the three characteristics of federalism as a method of organizing political affairs. And what World Federalists do is seek to apply these principles to the world, to build up the rule of law, to strengthen international organizations like the UN, and to make global governance more accountable and more democratic and more rights-based, if we could use that term. Now, what you'll notice is that I didn't describe world federalism as the way you did initially in terms of world government. But of course, a government is what you would have at the end point of the application of these principles. But we recognize that in today's world, we have to approach our advocacy for World Federalist goals on a sort of a step-by-step basis. The reason that your debate in high school was probably framed World Federalism as being a call for world government is because that's really the way people looked at World Federalism in those days. The UN was very new. The world had just emerged.
It was just then being formed, because that would have been, forgotten exactly, 45 was when the UN was founded, and it would have been about then that the whole conversation about World Federalism was sort of at the height, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, you said 72 years ago, so that would have been 1948. The UN, as you say, was
You're right.
that was formed in 45, and this year marks the 75th anniversary of the UN. So, which is the anniversary that's at the heart of the UN 2020 project, which was a very that was really up for grabs and politically in those times.
So the UN would have just been brand new.
Yeah. And so many people thought about it as a movement for world government, and that's the way the movement was organized, and World Federalists were very critical of the UN that did get created, critical of the vetoes in the Security Council and the strong role that the permanent members have in running and continue to have in running what takes place at the UN.
I did a little cheating before I checked Wikipedia, and Wikipedia said that Einstein, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King, as well as Wendell Willkie, would have all been World Federalists. Now, I suppose there wasn't such a thing as a card-carrying member, but I think you said that the Indians in particular, Gandhi and maybe Nehru and Madam Pandit, were all keen to have a stronger United Nations that would look more like what we might call world government. Is that tell me more about that, because I'm curious to see who else was on the side of stronger and who was on the side of being careful.
We have to remember that this was the aftermath of a world war, and the Americans were the dominant power at the time, and they really did lead in the creation of the UN, and so
the Americans who mostly wanted to make it more.
I don't think there was a uniform American view. There was different views. There were many different views. There was a number of American intellectuals. Norman Cousins, the editor of the Saturday Night Review, I think it was called, a magazine, was some say foremost among them, who wanted a more something that more resembled a government. And even one of the first projects that some of the American liberals that maybe lost the discussions around what kind of a UN we would have, quickly rallied to the 1948 adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is led by Eleanor Roosevelt, and a prominent Canadian in the drafting of that was as we know, John Humphrey, and he was a member of the Canadian section of the World Federalists as well. Okay. Human rights advocates, some of the great Canadian human rights advocates have also been World Federalists. The recently deceased Warren Allmond was president of our organization for many years, and also prior to that was president of the International Center for Human Rights and Democratic Development in Montreal. It's a World Federalism, so it's rooted in human rights and other rule of law imperatives that require an institutional basis. There is a need to strengthen institutions and strengthen and democratize them at the same time. Maybe we could look at the European Union as an example of, it's not quite a federation yet, but it's how the European Union has evolved is very much an example of the application of the principles of federalism that our movements call for. And I mean, we think of the European Union as beginning as a free trade area, but in fact the idea of linking up the initial core of democratic member states in a union was a peace project. The first treaty, the European Coal and Steel Community, was a union of the big industries that had twice in that century led Europe to horrific war, and so the idea is that by linking across boundaries in a trading area, peace that is the core of the union and the driving imperative. But of course, it's become much more than that as it's evolved and it's become more democratic.
The status of Europe as a union is not as secure as one might think. You know, I 5 years ago, I would have been shocked at the idea that it could ever be as wobbly as it seems to be now. But now you say it isn't really quite a federation yet. What would it take to be a federation? What's missing from the EU that if they had, you'd call it a federation?
I would say a more centralized governance than what they have now. I mean, right now, the European Parliament has co-legislative responsibilities over a range of budget matters, but the Commission, which is the bureaucracy of the European Union, still is most responsive to the Council, which is a council like a board of directors of the member states, the 27, or I guess it's 26 now with following Brexit. So it's the Council. So the gradual drift of history has been towards strengthening the Parliament and centralizing authority and democratizing the Union and sort of drawing authority away from the member states. And this is what the Leavers rebelled against in the UK, whether on the basis of accurate information or not, we can agree or disagree, but it would be a more centralized political entity. But it is a gradual process. I think I mean, the European Parliament was only first elected in 1979. It was initially formed as a consultative parliament using parliamentarians that were borrowed from national parliaments and sat at in Brussels and in Strasbourg to deliberate and do studies and hold leaders accountable and all those things that parliamentarians do. It was but it was a consultative body until 1979, and then thereafter, as the various reform efforts underway in the European Union after that, they usually included measures to strengthen the Parliament, and indeed it was often parliamentarians that were the instigators of reform and in the institution. And I mentioned the role of the European Parliament because that's it's a model for one of our current World Federalist campaigns, which is to apply the same playbook at the United Nations.
Let's look at the other side of things. Because on one hand, I hear people, I'm not an expert at all on Europe, but if I hear people say, well, the one thing they need most would be a better grasp of the economy, so there'd be more, the whole union would have more to say about expenditures and loans and balancing the financial budgets and things of the member states. And that, Greece, this was especially happening when there was a problem in Greece, and the allegation was that Germans were exploiting the Greeks because of balance of trade and things like that. So that you need to have a more centralized control of the finances of the whole union. On the other hand, it seems to me it's an opposite argument, that I hear that in fact there's the complaints that people and nationalists and the people leavers in Brexit complain about is that there is a democratic deficit, and that the people who are their representatives in the European Parliament are completely unfamiliar to them. They can't just drop in on their office and expect to be recognized the way they might with their local MP. And that this whole centralization tendency of the European Parliament is an anti-democratic a tendency rather than one that empowers people. So you are taking it for granted that what we need to do with the UN is strengthen representation of delegates and so on at the UN at the expense maybe of sovereign countries. Play with that. And John, you have a right to have an opinion too.
Do you want to go ahead, John? And
For sure. I think on the topic of the European Union and how democratic the system is, I think there's a lot of misinformation about how representative democracy necessarily gets rolled out in the context of the European Union. So this idea of sort of unelected bureaucrats and what have you is I think an area that is sort of blown out of proportion and sort of misrepresented. Certainly democracy is at the core of everything that the European Union does, and in the very structure of the European Union. Fergus could probably speak much better on the structures than myself, but I think there's been a lot of misinformation and talk with respect to and focus on and emphasis on this idea of unelected bureaucrats, which I don't think really holds a whole lot of water in reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Parliament are elected. The question is, if you're part of a constituency that has many millions of people in it, you don't have a whole lot of voice over who gets elected. Whereas if you're talking about your local city councilor, you might have a feeling that you have more influence.
The European Union has grown over the years by adding countries only after they became democratic. I mean, you have to be a democracy to get in. And the strengthening of the European Parliament is would make the thing more democratic, not less. And regarding you mentioned also the control over the financial levers that the European Union has or has not. The problem that the way most people assess the problems that arose over the Greek and Italian debt situations a few years ago is that the European Union has created a currency, the euro, that its members, most of them, use, but they don't have the ability to they don't have a shared fiscal policy with the kind of political management over spending that we would normally associate with a national government. So it limits the extent to which you can manage some of these financial crises when you can't expand liquidity in a situation by saying doing more spending as for example, governments did in response to the 2008 financial crisis. Every time there's a need for more liquidity, the member states of the European Union have to get around and decide, and there's a whole bunch of wrangling, and usually the stronger France and Germany tend to prevail because they're the strongest economies, and their views are not often the most sympathetic to the affected governments. So it's seen as an area in need of reform.
What is the general tendency among activists in the World Federalist movement to press for additional reforms or structural changes? You know what's going on at the UN, and I know there's this 2020 movement that you're very engaged with. Maybe you almost run it, but I wonder if John can give a sense at the more or less grassroots level. When you have meetings of the World Federalists here in Toronto, and you take a sense of what people are exercised about or concerned, what kinds of changes do you sense there's a demand for, or a wish that could be achieved?
So I think the principles of world federalism are really what people are attracted to who are members of the local branch or chapter of the World Federalist movement. And one of the key principles that we have is subsidiarity, in the sense that political decisions should be made at the level most appropriate. So local decisions are made at a local level, regional decisions at a regional level, and of course global matters of global importance are decided at a global level. So that's just the key ethos, I think, that a lot of us abide by. Also the idea of strengthening our global democratic institutions, making sure that we can expand upon the different kinds of institutions that we have that wade into that global decision making, and also making sure that citizens have representation as well at the global level, so that we're trying to foster an environment of concerned citizens that want to get involved in discussions around global politics, global governance, and of course achieving global peace.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Fergus?
Well, I mean, peace is for most World Federalists the most important imperative, and one thing we do work on quite a lot in the Canadian context and an international context is peacekeeping. There's a lot more that the UN could be doing, and that Canada could be doing to support peacekeeping. In a Canadian context, we've tried to hold the government to account for the promises they made and not kept during the last administration. I mean, they said that they would commit 600 troops and 150 police and really get Canada back into peacekeeping, and what we got was a short 1 year deployment of roughly 250 personnel to Mali, and now we're back out again. And so we want to continue our work for Canadian engagement in peacekeeping, but there's also a lot that institutionally that one could look at in terms of the UN system and how its work for peace, sustainable peace is the term the Secretary General uses these days to encompass a range of activities, from mediation to conflict resolution, through peacekeeping and to the post-conflict reconstruction and peace building. And if you look at the machinery and the departments within the UN system responsible for doing all of those activities, that they're almost all underfunded. I mean, this is the story of the UN. Governments just don't want to invest, and one of the key aspects of Donald Trump, Trump's administration's undermining of international order is to reduce the American financial contributions again to various UN programs. I mean, peacekeeping, the UN deploys around 100,000 military personnel around the world. The budget for this is 7 or 8 billion, which is less than half of 1% of what the world spends on militaries. It's grossly underfunded and under-resourced. But in addition to that, the system of constructing deployments for peacekeeping relies on basically, making up a peacekeeping force every time the Security Council identifies the need for one, and rather than so you could do a lot of good by having permanent capacities, whether they're police capacities or peacekeeping capacities, so that there would not be a delay when you need a peacekeeping force to be deployed. There would be something there that would we're not talking about a large army here. We're talking 10 or 15,000 troops, so that you could send something in that would be sort of first in and first out, and then the national contingents could take over. So there are these kinds of incremental improvements to the UN system that are sort of keep people like Fergus and John and others engaged on a daily basis. There's no shortage of ways that you could strengthen the UN system. The problem is that is finding the will to do it, and I think we're in a looking at the prospects for strengthening the UN. We're at a kind of a pretty historical turning point, because, as we mentioned in our earlier discussion around Metta's high school debates, and the times that the UN was created and the role of the Americans, I think we're seeing now that with the rise of China, with the doctrine of the American administration now, and the decline of the utility of American military power, failed interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think the dimensions of power, the concepts of security are changing, and I think there is a move to a more multipolar world. And
you didn't mention one thing that I would have thought you'd say you'd have to brag about, which is the International Criminal Court. I mean, there wasn't really anything like that originally, and in a way, isn't that a sort of the creation of it, which is about 20 years ago, I guess now, was a real step forward. And now it looks to me like it is under attack quite a bit too. What do you think? Is this an important element of moving toward good, solid global governance?
It is a more than important. It's revolutionary. I'm taking you up on your offer to brag. It's a historic development. Its potential is not fully realized. The International Court is a treaty, so only 123 governments out of the 193 around the world are members of the court, and some of the big powers are not. It's meant to try.
Oh, really? Tell me, which big powers are? Oh, the U.S. is not. What else?
The U.S. is on the outside. Russia, China, India are all on the outside. So normatively, it's created a sea change in international humanitarian law, and the very concept of that you would be able to hold national leaders accountable. So the concept is I mean, it's not a new idea. There was Nuremberg and the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals that were meant to be established. The whole a World Criminal Court was supposed to be established as part of the UN's machinery, but it wasn't. They had Nuremberg and the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals were ad hoc, and only after the Cold War did the Security Council find the basis for establishing other ad hoc tribunals like Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, and then that laid the basis for this development of an international criminal court. And
we foresaw the challenge of perhaps another resurgence of ultranationalism in the world. And one of the best ways that the early World Federalists sought to prevent that from happening and turning into another global conflict is essentially ensuring that the UN is as democratic as possible, ensuring that there is a world judiciary that is a part of that component, and that nations of the world, all nations of the world, participate in dealing with that system of governance. So, I mean, really, a lot of what we believe is what the leading thinkers of the day at the time that the United Nations was formed. It's the original dream of what the United Nations had supposed to have been about.
The notion of democratic representation has something to do with the numbers of delegates you get per 100,000 capita or something. What are some of the plans or proposals? I know that we hear people talking wishfully about the development of a parliamentary assembly, which would be different from the General Assembly. The General Assembly is represented by states, and a parliamentary assembly would have a different basis. Can you explain what that would be like and why that might be or desirable? I assume you think it might be desirable.
Anytime you can democratize governance at any level, it's a good thing. Democracy is to be encouraged. Now, democratizing an international organization like the United Nations is, let's face it, it's a massive project that is going to take generations. The most widely subscribed campaign is the campaign for a parliamentary assembly, and that takes the examples of other parliamentary assemblies around the world and how they have evolved, and says, well, let's do the same thing at the UN. Let's have a chamber for citizen representatives. And now the first problem you encounter is to recognize that, well, most governments are not democratic. So how could you have a democratic entity at the UN? And you couldn't. So you would need to begin, and this is true of the early days of the what is now called the European Union, that their parliament was a consultative body, parliamentarians borrowed from national parliaments, and but they did sit as a parliament. Conservatives from Germany and Belgium sat with conservatives from other countries, and so the things that parliaments do is study issues from the basis of what do people want, and that's quite different from what you get at the UN, which is bargaining and consensus on the basis of what nations can agree to. So it would be an important step for accountability, for making the activities of the UN better known, and bringing the voices of in UN parlance, we the peoples, which is the phrase from the beginning of the Charter, bringing the voices of citizens to bear. When you think about some of the really top, most important issues that the UN grapples with, there is a growing interest among NGOs and people in strengthening the system to be more responsive to citizen concerns. And I mean, the obvious example here was the worldwide climate protests with Greta Thunberg as the sort of the symbolic leader of that. But you know, what we have in the Paris Climate Treaty is kind of the best that the nation state system can do, and everybody agrees it's not good enough. It's a system based on nationally determined contributions to mitigating climate change. So you have nations, because you know they love their sovereignty, and they're gonna be the ones that determine, you know, how much my country does or the X country does. So Canada determines what its contribution is going to be, and then you put all these contributions together, and surprise, surprise, it doesn't meet the global goal enshrined in the Paris Treaty. So there's a number of pressing issues where we just aren't getting decisions that are good enough on global issues. And so there is, you know, that gives rise to these institutional questions. And I mean, one has to be pragmatic and visionary at the same time in terms of how you advocate for these changes. And one of the, you know, areas that John works on is cybersecurity, and that's the UN system has just begun to talk about and come to grips with you know, cybersecurity and the impacts of artificial intelligence on its mandates for, you know, for sustainable development and peace and security. So there's a, you know, the range of global issues. I mean, Metta, you and I have been active for years in the anti-nuclear movement. I mean, that's what got me into this in the first place. But the number of global issues for which nation states and the nation state system is inadequate are growing, not diminishing.
Yeah. Okay. That is worrisome, because I know that you are engaged with this thing at the UN, this 2020 reform movement, and I don't hear enough about it, and I don't hear enough evidence that anybody has a game plan for how to urgently change the system. You know, if things were as bad as you've suggested, and I think they're probably even worse, you know, I get, you know, nightmares over the looming threats of melting permafrost and things like that. And I don't see any institutional changes that seem to suggest we'll be able to handle it with any of the structures that exist now. I'm not even sure how much demand there is at the local level. I mean, John, you have more finger on the pulse of you know, a local group of World Federalists who are undoubtedly among the most progressive, that is to say, forward-looking and looking for international and multilateral institutions, much more so than the conservatives who harbor all these climate deniers and stuff. What do you hear when people get together? What do they complain about, and what kinds of radical ideas? What's the most radical idea that you hear floated in meetings when you are chairing World Federalist meetings here in Toronto?
We have such a plethora of views amongst our members. There's individuals who are right across the political spectrum that participate in World Federalism. So we have folks who tend more towards conservatism, and others who tend towards liberalism and democratic socialism. And really, you know, we've even had members who have more fringe views on the extreme that have shown up to meetings, members of the public who may also be completely unaffiliated with World Federalism. So we have an opportunity here, a plethora of views across the spectrum. One of the views that I think tends to be much more radical these days is the topic of world government. I think that that is one that is always hotly debated and contentious. Certainly outside of world federalism, but even amongst our own members, we have differing views in terms of, should we necessarily work towards world government, or should we focus much more on regional unions and what have you in the short term, and look towards sort of longer term global governance structures and in a much more longer span of time. So those are the kinds of things that are debated, and also just issues of the day. So Fergus had mentioned, cyberspace. So recently, a lot of the dialogue that's been happening at our local meetings is on the topic of what the role of the UN should necessarily be in dealing with matters related to cyber warfare. When we have nation states going to war, what's the role that the UN can play to sort of prevent global conflict, including the development of a cyber peacekeeping force that can get involved in these matters, perhaps serve as an independent arbiter of information about nation states going to war. So a certain cyber attack and trying to attribute one attack to a particular nation state, and then involving themselves in the political process to prevent any larger or wider conflict from growing from that. So that tends to be a topic that's discussed most recently.
I have never heard that expression before. Cyber peacekeeping. That is a totally new idea, and immediately my ears flap. What in the world would you do as a cyber peacekeeper, other than recommend something and hope that somebody else will put it into effect? How would you actually intervene to prevent? I mean, I think of peacekeepers, classically, it was a group of people who put themselves between two warring sides and say, stop there, you can't fight anymore. How could a peacekeeping team prevent any of the nefarious activities that cyber trolls and spooks and bad guys are up to?
So much of that infrastructure is held publicly in the hands of corporations and other public entities. So it really is kind of like a global commons. When one nation state decides to attack another nation state, the UN could provide the expertise, as an example, to help the nation state that's the victim of a cyber attack bolster their national defenses, re-enable services that have potentially been disrupted as a result of that attack, rerouting traffic to other more secure servers and safe sites to filter out information that would otherwise be malicious in nature. So there's a lot of things that can be done. And one of the things that's been floated is that the United Nations could play an effective role as a credible international organization to create those structures such that the next time that a nation state undergoes an attack, there is a group of individuals that have the expertise and have the technology at their disposal to do something meaningful to prevent that from escalating, and also to, just as I mentioned before, attribute attacks to particular nation states. It's a very difficult, very expensive thing to do, but it's not entirely outside of the realm of possibility that an independent group of forensic investigators, as an example, could look at the signs and signals and indicators of a particular attack, gather forensic information, maybe even deploying to that affected nation state and collecting intelligence information that could lead to an understanding of what happened and who is the perpetrator of that event in a credible and independent way. So those are just some ideas that have been floated around, and our president, Walter Dorn, is heavily involved in studying these sort of issues in much more depth and coming up with position papers on the topic.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful thought. I'd like to see it fleshed out, see what it looked like. But as of now, so far as I know, all of the efforts at the United Nations to even reach an agreement about what kinds of rules should be implemented or established and agreed to they have these group of governmental experts who keep meeting, and now I think there's an additional process going on, is there not? Not just the GGE's meeting, but there's another open-ended working group or something that is trying to address the same problems about cybersecurity separately. And so far, I don't think any of them have been able to come up with any agreement. And as I understand it, I may be wrong, Fergus, you probably know, it's really the countries that have the edge now that don't want to give up their edge, that the U.S. in particular doesn't want to agree to any limitation on their aggressive potential. The rules of what would be legal for a nation to do by way of a cyber attack on another nation, or something. Here I'm in over my head. I don't exactly know what I'm talking about, but maybe you can straighten me out between you two of them.
Closest thing that we have is sort of an effort out of Estonia to create a set of legal norms. It was the Tallinn manual that was pulled together, but establishing an understanding of those legal norms, of the extent to which nation states are able to engage in cyber warfare and what the limitations should be, is a little bit different than actually identifying what are the specific behaviors from a technical point of view that constitute cyber war and cyber conflict. And I think that's where there's still a lot of work to be done in defining exactly what those behaviors are and what they look like. Most recently, I think it was France that had floated their own idea of what some of those normative behaviors should be. But once again, I think an organization like the UN can stake out global leadership by struggling with these big complex problems, and recommending to nation states, member states, how we should approach the complex problems associated with nations staking out their national interests within a set of global infrastructure that really should be regarded as a public commons. But we need more global institutions that are tackling these problems and being thought leaders and sharing a perspective and a view, so that we can coalesce some common understanding of how we should operate.
Yeah, I'll defer to John in terms of the technical aspects of cybersecurity, but just to add one point about how the UN works and can work. When we think of some of these new areas of governance, we need not despair that just because the Americans and the Chinese don't want to play ball with the others who want to try and regulate and create a rule of law around a body of threats like cyber threats. One of the things that we've seen where the UN has been successful is that often it's small and medium governments that come together in the General Assembly that can be the drivers of change. And we've seen this with the Landmines Treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the Arms Trade Treaty, the International Criminal Court. It's one doesn't have to wait for every member state to agree on something. And what you get when you're able to do that is we don't have a global government that is making laws, and so international law forms and evolves on the basis of precedent and recognition by majority scholars and experts and governments, and so if you get a majority of governments say following Estonia's lead and forming a treaty process, I mean, that would be the next step would be to explore something like that.
Well, is there any initiative moving forward from the Tallinn document to anybody trying to do anything with that, or is there a step?
Not yet.
No?
I think it's still early days. I mean, I mentioned that you can have majorities in the General Assembly as a driver of change to the international order, but that doesn't make it easy. I mean, you still have to, push these governments and like governments like our own, for example, have been resistant to some of the changes that we've wanted to see in terms of other security threats like nuclear weapons, because they're part of international alliances like NATO, and so these coalitions of the willing is it takes a lot of diplomatic slogging.
Mm-hmm. Last time I interviewed you a year or so ago, this 2020 process was sort of in an early phase. Well, here we are in 2020. And I want to know what you have in mind. There is a process at the UN for suggesting some reforms, that it's high time the UN makes some structural changes. What do you have in mind, and what are we in for?
The UN 2020 campaign is a civil society campaign, and we began in 2017, and it has grown to include representatives from a range of different sectors of civil society. But we're dealing with an environment at the UN that is quite polarized. You mentioned nationalists and authoritarian governments being on the rise, and there is, in response to this, pushback from governments that see this as a threat, and they are supported by a UN secretariat. So we're in a context where things are polarized, and so the resolution of the UN that was passed in June 2019 regarding the modalities for how the UN would commemorate its 75th anniversary has led to the secretariat convening what they hope will be and claim will be the largest ever global dialogue on, to quote the resolution, the future we want and the UN we need.
A dialogue is people talking to each other. Who's going to show up and talk to whom?
If you go to UN 75, the website, you will see a whole suite of different modalities for engaging this dialogue. It can be, I mean, from parliaments to village councils. They want people talking about the UN and what is needed and to provide, what is needed institutionally to provide the future we want, and what does the UN we need look like. Now, that's a dialogue that the Secretariat is driving, but what governments are going to negotiate is a political declaration around the 75th anniversary. And we've had early consultations with the two governments that are managing the co-facilitators of that political declaration process. And unsurprisingly, they report that it's a very polarized debate, and in a polarized debate in the General Assembly, you don't get agreement on much. So,
which ones are out in lead? All I can think of the people, I can name plenty of laggards, but I can't think of who would be really thinking up bold, new, progressive, and innovative proposals.
It's not at the level of particular proposals. It's more just establishing the need for a stronger UN, and then there would be. So we haven't even got as far as to talk about I mean, some of the reform proposals at the UN have their own separate negotiation processes, like the Security Council process, which has been deadlocked for decades.
Well, we need to mention that before we're through, because that clearly is the elephant in the room.
Well, yes and no. I think that what we're looking at in a campaign is language. So you asked about who the good guys are, who is supporting progressive reform of the UN, and there are some in every region of the world. But the European Union itself has been very good. Canada has been fairly good on at least the principles and supporting, and they carry that point of view through. They often, how they often negotiate at the UN with partnering with Australia and New Zealand. Other progressive governments that we have worked with include Uruguay, Malaysia, Costa Rica, Senegal, Nigeria, believe it or not, Jordan, Estonia has been very helpful. We were mentioning them, Estonia is just a very progressive government. Generally, we mentioned their work on cyber issues, so Korea is another strong ally. They are co-sponsoring there will be a civil society international forum that will lead to a civil society declaration and plan of action. And there you will have a range of different ideas for how the UN could work better. The best we're hoping for from governments in the political declaration negotiations is a commitment to carry the discussion forward, to not use the 75th anniversary of the UN as a birthday party, but to say, okay, we really need to take stock. It's 75 years. The world has changed. Let's have a look at this, and that is the issue that whether to use the 75th as an opportunity for strengthening the UN or not. That is the issue that is going to divide governments and has already begun in the negotiations of the political declaration. So. But there are some, one of the ideas that's making the rounds is that you would have a repeat of the Commission on Global Governance that was supported by Sweden in the 1990s. There was a big international commission that produced a report, and sometimes these reports, make a difference. I mean, think of the whole sustainable development movement. Well, that was the result of a commission that was led by Gro Harlem Brundtland on environment and development, and brought about a reconceptualization of what is development, and in that it needs to take account of future generations' needs and so on. So the idea of a commission process has been floated, and also the idea of something led out of the Secretary General's office. So these are examples of if every government in the world isn't going to agree in a political declaration that the General Assembly passes, well, maybe those governments that do want a better UN can find a political space to do the work, and it will be, by then it'll be this current Secretary General's second term. And he is a reformer, so that's another idea that's out there. So the UN 2020 campaign is I guess the best I can offer is that it's likely to be continued beyond 2020.
Okay, but you mentioned that this dialogue that should happen at many levels, including local people. Let's put on an event. I mean, I don't know. How about it, John? Let's figure out how to get some people together for a day to talk about what kind of UN we want for the future. And I'd love to be involved in trying to invite people to let's go out in the park and sit under a tree or something and discuss this. How about it?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's a lot of what the Toronto chapter is trying to do for this year. Organize many more public events where we can bring together people to discuss some of these key and critical issues, and also just generally getting citizens involved in matters related to global governance. There's not enough thought put into the meat and potatoes of the issues that we have to contend with in the world today, and how those issues necessarily affect our local economies and our local issues. whatever we can do to sort of bring people together to discuss, to foster that sense of global community and that sense that all citizens of the world are dealing with a lot of the same challenges. So we should, come together in solidarity and debate and discuss and raise awareness of what needs to be done.
Okay,
and I could just add that that if the event that takes place in Toronto, if you link it with the UN 75 process, the website and so on, that would ensure that the outcomes of your discussions also feed into the Secretary General's reporting to the General Assembly. There's an interim report in April and a final report in September. When the September 21st is the time when there will be a leaders summit at the UN commemorating the 75th anniversary. But
yeah, okay.
The good thing about this effort is it could hold also the possibility of creating a movement in movements where we would gather together other groups and organizations that maybe are not World Federalist organizations, but are also concerned about a lot of the same kinds of global issues. So I think
the sense of urgency about climate is where you're going to get people with high levels of motivation. People who say, yes, our house is on fire. We have to do something now. And that's
absolutely.
why, I'm of that persuasion. Yeah.
Yeah. Issues of our global warming and what have you are definitely areas that can galvanize a lot of global thinking and drive a lot of global solutions as well.
Okay. So we've got a plan in the works. I'm delighted. This is a very good conversation, and I appreciate both of your contributions to it. So thanks very much, and it's time for us to say goodbye.
well, thanks for inviting us.
All right, take care.
Take care, Metta.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.